February 23, 1945. The morning sun climbed over the volcanic ridges of northern Luzon as Captain James Henderson crouched inside his forward observation post, field telephone pressed against his ear. Below him, through the dissipating mist, stretched the Cagayan Valley where elements of General Tomoyuki Yamashita's Shobu group had dug into positions they believed impregnable. Henderson adjusted his binoculars, scanning the tree line 800 yards distant where Japanese artillery had fired sporadically through the night. 3 rounds, maybe 4, during 8 hours of darkness. Harassing fire, the Americans called it. Random shells lobbed toward their lines with no apparent pattern or coordination. The psychological effect worked both ways. For the Japanese, each precious round expended represented ammunition they could never replace. For Henderson and the men of the 25th Infantry Division's 8th Field Artillery Battalion, that sporadic enemy, fire revealed a truth more devastating than any bombardment could be. The Japanese were running out of shells. Henderson keyed his radio and transmitted grid coordinates to the Fire Direction Center 3 miles behind the line. Within 90 seconds, he heard the first shells whistling overhead. American 105mm howitzers. 12 guns firing in coordinated volleys that walked across the Japanese positions with methodical precision. Henderson counted the impacts. 12, 24, 36. 48 shells in less than 3 minutes, more high explosive than the Japanese battery opposite him would fire in an entire week. The mathematical disparity told a story that neither courage nor tactical skill could overcome. The Americans were firing 10 shells for every one the Japanese could answer with, sometimes 20-1. In sustained barrages, the ratio approached numbers that made traditional artillery calculations meaningless. This wasn't a duel between gun crews of equal capability, separated by ideology and circumstance. This was industrial capacity weaponized, the output of Detroit and Pittsburgh transformed into a rain of steel that never stopped, never slackened, never gave the enemy a moment's respite to reorganize or resupply. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The journey toward this moment of overwhelming firepower superiority had begun 3 years earlier, not on Pacific battlefields, but in the factories and training grounds of a nation mobilizing for total war. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, summer of 1942. Lieutenant Henderson, fresh from officer candidate school, reported to the Field Artillery School for advanced training in fire direction procedures. The United States Army was building an artillery arm that would eclipse anything the Axis powers could field. But the transformation required more than simply manufacturing guns in quantity. It demanded a systematic approach to coordinating fire, a communications network that could mass hundreds of guns on single targets, and a logistical system capable of sustaining unprecedented rates of ammunition expenditure. Henderson's instructors emphasized principles that would have seemed wasteful to Japanese artillery doctrine. American fire direction centers coordinated the fires of multiple batteries, sometimes entire battalions, on targets that Japanese commanders would assign to individual guns. Forward observers with frontline infantry units communicated target locations through radio networks that connected battalion, regiment, and division artillery. Most critically, American gunners trained to fire massive preparatory bombardments, consuming thousands of rounds in minutes, trusting that the industrial base back home could replace every shell expended. The numbers told their own story about industrial preparedness. By 1942, American factories were producing artillery ammunition at rates that dwarfed Japanese capacity. A single medium-sized American munitions plant produced more shells monthly than Japan's entire industrial base could manufacture. This disparity would only grow more pronounced as the war progressed, as American production accelerated, while Japanese capacity degraded under the weight of Allied submarine warfare and strategic bombing. Japanese artillery doctrine, by contrast, emphasized conservation and precision. Battery commanders received strict ammunition allowances and faced severe consequences for exceeding allocated expenditures. Individual guns operated independently. forbidden to coordinate fires without explicit permission from higher headquarters. The elaborate fire direction systems that allowed Americans to mass artillery rapidly simply did not exist in Japanese military organization. Communication networks were inadequate for coordinating battalion-level fires. Most fundamentally, Japanese artillery philosophy emphasized support of infantry attacks rather than the sustained defensive fires or massive preparatory bombardments that American doctrine required. These doctrinal differences reflected deeper realities about industrial capacity and strategic circumstance. Japan had entered the Pacific War with limited ammunition stocks and no prospect of replacing expenditures at rates comparable to American production. Conservation became necessity, elevated to military virtue because no alternative existed. American artillery officers who studied captured Japanese fire plans found meticulous attention to ammunition management, with daily allocations specifying exactly how many rounds each battery could fire for registration, harassing fire, and defensive concentrations. The transformation of American artillery from a peacetime arm into the most powerful force multiplier in military history accelerated through 1943 and into 1944. By the time Henderson's battalion deployed to the Pacific Theater in October 1944, they represented the end product of a system that had been refined through North African and European campaigns. Each gun crew had fired thousands of practice rounds. Forward observers had trained extensively in calling for fire while moving with infantry units. Fire direction centers had practiced coordinating battalion and division artillery until the procedures became instinctive. Most importantly, the logistical tail that sustained operations had been tested and proven capable of moving unprecedented quantities of ammunition from ships to forward positions. The contrast with Japanese artillery preparation was stark. Many Japanese artillery units stationed in the Philippines had never participated in large-scale operations. They had spent years in garrison positions in Manchuria or the home islands, conducting limited training constrained by ammunition shortages. When American forces returned to the Philippines in October 1944, these units faced combat against an enemy whose firepower exceeded their most pessimistic calculations. The first major engagement where Henderson witnessed the artillery disparity in full measure came during the Battle of Leyte in November 1944. His battalion supported the advance of infantry units pushing toward Ormoc, the last major Japanese stronghold on the island. Japanese forces occupying fortified positions in the hills launched a counterattack supported by their available artillery. Henderson watched through binoculars as Japanese shells began falling on American positions. The fire came sporadically, individual guns firing 3 or 4 rounds before falling silent. He counted perhaps 20 impacts over 15 minutes of firing. The American response was overwhelming. Henderson's battalion alone fired over 400 rounds in the first 10 minutes of counter-battery fire. Division artillery added another 6 battalions to the concentration, walking fires across every suspected Japanese gun position. Aircraft overhead spotted for the guns, directing fire onto targets that revealed themselves through muzzle flash or dust. The Japanese artillery fell silent within 30 minutes, either destroyed or forced to displace to alternate positions. The infantry counterattack collapsed under the weight of American fire support before it penetrated American lines. Henderson later learned that division artillery had expended over 3,000 rounds during 4 hours of fighting. Japanese artillery, by contrast, had fired perhaps 200 shells during the entire engagement. The 10-to-1 disparity revealed itself not as theoretical calculation, but as battlefield reality observed through the smoke and thunder of actual combat. The logistical system that sustained this level of firepower represented an achievement as significant as the guns themselves. Supply. Ships arrived daily at captured beaches, disgorging thousands of tons of artillery ammunition. Shore parties worked around the clock to move shells inland, building supply dumps that stretched for acres. Truck convoys ran continuous shuttles from beach dumps to battalion ammunition points, replacing expenditures faster than guns could fire. A single American artillery battalion consumed over 200 tons of ammunition during a week of heavy fighting. Japanese artillery battalions operating at the end of supply lines interdicted by submarines and aircraft, struggled to accumulate 200 tons during months of stockpiling. Henderson saw this disparity manifested in captured Japanese positions after Leyte fell to American control. Abandoned artillery positions contained perhaps 50 to 100 rounds per gun, carefully hoarded reserves that commanders had been too cautious to expend. American artillery positions, by contrast, featured ammunition stacked in pyramids, with thousands of rounds available for immediate firing. The invasion of Luzon in January 1945 brought Henderson face to face with the strategic implications of artillery superiority carried to its ultimate conclusion. The landing at Lingayen Gulf proceeded under the umbrella of naval gunfire that dwarfed anything Japanese forces could answer with. Battleships and cruisers pumped thousands of shells into suspected defensive positions, while Henderson's battalion prepared to come ashore with the assault waves. By the time infantry hit the beaches, Henderson's unit had already established itself inland, guns emplaced and ready to fire support missions. The speed of this deployment reflected months of practice and the mechanical efficiency of a logistical system perfected through repeated amphibious operations. Japanese artillery, by contrast, remained silent during the landing, commanders unwilling to reveal positions that American counter-battery fire would obliterate within minutes. The advance toward Manila demonstrated artillery's role as the primary weapon system of American ground forces. Infantry units moved with confidence born of knowing overwhelming fire support was available within minutes of any call for assistance. Henderson's forward observers accompanied rifle companies, maintaining constant radio contact with fire direction centers that could coordinate battalion fires on targets measured in yards rather than miles. When Japanese forces attempted to establish defensive positions, American artillery crushed resistance before infantry assaulted. The pattern repeated across Luzon with mechanical regularity. Japanese defenders occupying carefully prepared positions found themselves subjected to bombardments that lasted hours, sometimes days. American fire direction procedures allowed guns to fire around the clock, crews rotating through shifts while ammunition flowed forward in endless convoys. By February 1945, as American forces closed on Manila, the artillery disparity had become so pronounced that Japanese commanders altered their defensive tactics entirely. Rather than concentrating artillery in support of organized resistance, they dispersed guns into individual positions, hidden in caves or fortified buildings, where they might survive American counter-battery fire long enough to fire a few rounds before being destroyed. This dispersal reduced artillery effectiveness, but represented the only option available to commanders who understood that any concentrated fire would draw overwhelming response. Henderson participated in the reduction of these dispersed positions throughout the Battle of Manila. Forward observers called fire missions on individual buildings suspected of containing Japanese guns. American artillery responded with concentrations that reduced entire city blocks to rubble. The destruction was devastating, contributing to the civilian casualties that made Manila one of the war's most tragic urban battles. But from a purely military standpoint, the tactics reflected the logical conclusion of overwhelming firepower superiority. When one side could fire 10 shells for every one the enemy answered with, concentrated defensive fires became suicide. The human dimension of this artillery disparity became apparent through the accounts of captured Japanese artillery officers interrogated after Manila fell. Major Takeshi Yamamoto, commanding an artillery battalion defending the city's southern approaches, described the psychological impact of American firepower in terms that transcended tactical analysis. His unit had arrived in Manila with full ammunition stocks, perhaps 3,000 rounds carefully accumulated through months of careful conservation. They had prepared firing positions with meticulous attention to camouflage and overhead protection, confident that their guns could support the defensive battle that would make Manila too costly for Americans to capture. The reality shattered those assumptions within days. American counter-battery fire, directed by spotter aircraft and sophisticated sound-ranging equipment, destroyed or damaged half of Yamamoto's guns during the first week of fighting. His crews fired conservatively, 3 or 4 rounds before displacing to alternate positions, but American artillery answered each salvo with concentrations of 50 to 100 shells. By the second week, Yamamoto's battalion was down to 6 operational guns and fewer than 500 rounds of ammunition. The desperation of Japanese ammunition shortages manifested in orders that would have seemed incomprehensible to American artillery officers. Battery commanders received instructions to fire only when targets of exceptional value presented themselves. Harassing fire, once a standard artillery mission, was forbidden except by explicit division order. Most tellingly, Japanese gunners were ordered to prepare their remaining ammunition for destruction rather than risk its capture, preferring to deny Americans even the symbolic victory of seizing intact shells. These orders reflected not just tactical prudence but the psychological collapse that accompanies recognition of utter material inferiority. Yamamoto later told interrogators that his men understood they faced an enemy who possessed unlimited ammunition, an opponent who could fire continuously without concern for conservation because the shells would always be replaced. This knowledge, more than any tactical defeat, destroyed whatever confidence remained in Japanese defensive capabilities. Henderson witnessed the final phase of organized Japanese resistance in northern Luzon with mixed feelings of professional satisfaction and human pity. His battalion had participated in the systematic destruction of Yamashita's Shobu group, firing hundreds of thousands of rounds into mountain positions where Japanese forces attempted final stands. The artillery had been devastating, reducing fortified cave systems to collapsed rubble, interdicting supply routes, and making any movement during daylight hours suicidal for defenders. But Henderson also saw the human cost measured in the emaciated bodies of Japanese soldiers killed not by shells but by starvation, resulting from supply lines cut by artillery fire. The guns that dominated battlefields also determined who could eat, who could receive medical supplies, who could maintain even minimal standards of military organization. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistical accounting of American artillery superiority told a story as impressive as it was terrible. During the campaign for Luzon, from January through June 1945, American artillery fired over 3 million rounds of ammunition, ranging from small 75mm shells to massive 8-inch howitzer projectiles. Japanese artillery fired perhaps 300,000 rounds during the same period, and most of those during the early weeks before American counter-battery fire and ammunition shortages reduced Japanese capabilities to near zero. The 10-to-1 disparity that Henderson had first observed on Leyte actually understated American superiority by war's end. By May 1945, the ratio approached 20 or 30 to 1 in many sectors, with some Japanese artillery units reduced to firing fewer than 10 rounds per day, while American guns fired thousands. The industrial dimension of this firepower disparity extended beyond the artillery pieces themselves to encompass the entire system that kept guns supplied and operational. American ammunition production had reached staggering levels by 1945, with factories producing millions of shells monthly. The logistical network that moved this ammunition from American factories to forward positions in the Philippines functioned with the efficiency of a well-managed business. Ships arrived on schedules, shore parties unloaded with mechanical precision, truck convoys ran established routes without deviation. Japanese logistics, by contrast, had collapsed entirely under the weight of American submarine warfare and air superiority. Ammunition that might have been manufactured in Japanese factories never reached the Philippines. Stocks that survived submarine attacks sat uselessly in rear areas, unable to move forward under American air interdiction. The human cost of this disparity was measured not just in casualties but in the psychological impact on survivors. Japanese artillery crews who had trained for years in their specialty found themselves reduced to infantry support roles, their guns silent for lack of ammunition while American shells fell continuously. The professional pride that sustained military organizations eroded under the reality that skill and training meant nothing when ammunition ran out. American artillery crews, by contrast, developed confidence that approached arrogance, knowing they could fire as many shells as any tactical situation required without facing shortages or restrictions. This psychological dimension of material superiority proved as decisive as the physical destruction inflicted by the shells themselves. By late May 1945, as organized Japanese resistance in the Philippines approached its end, Henderson's battalion had fired over 200,000 rounds since landing at Lingayen Gulf 5 months earlier. The guns had worn their barrels smooth and required replacement. Crews were exhausted from continuous operations, but the ammunition kept flowing forward, replacing expenditures faster than the battalion could fire. Henderson calculated that his single battalion had fired more shells during the Philippine campaign than the entire Japanese artillery arm on Luzon. The statistic seemed almost fictional in its disproportion, but the numbers validated what battlefield observation had already confirmed. The Americans hadn't just brought more guns to the Philippines. They had brought the industrial output of an entire continent, transformed into firepower that rendered Japanese resistance militarily futile regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. The technical sophistication underlying American artillery dominance extended far beyond simple numerical superiority in guns and ammunition. In his forward observation post overlooking the Cagayan Valley, Captain Henderson utilized equipment and procedures that Japanese artillery officers could only dream of possessing. His radio connected directly to the Battalion Fire Direction Center, a specially trained team of specialists who plotted targets, calculated firing data, and coordinated the fires of multiple batteries with precision that approached scientific certainty. When Henderson called for fire, he provided grid coordinates accurate to within 10 meters. The Fire Direction Center translated those coordinates into azimuth, elevation, and propellant charges for each gun. Within 3 minutes of Henderson's initial call, shells were impacting the target with accuracy that previous generations of artillerymen would have considered impossible. Japanese artillery fire direction, by contrast, remained trapped in procedures that dated to the First World War. Battery commanders received target locations through written orders or voice communication over unreliable field telephone lines. Each gun calculated its own firing data, with no centralized fire direction center to coordinate multiple batteries. The result was artillery fire that lacked the concentration and precision American guns achieved routinely. When multiple Japanese batteries attempted to fire on the same target, shells arrived scattered across wide areas, diluting their effect. American batteries firing coordinated missions placed shells within a target, area measured in square meters, achieving devastating concentration of explosive force. The communications revolution that enabled American artillery effectiveness represented years of investment in radio technology and operator training. Every American forward observer carried a portable radio weighing 35 pounds, capable of reaching the fire direction center from distances exceeding 10 miles. Battalion fire direction centers maintained radio contact with division artillery, allowing rapid coordination of fires beyond the battalion's organic guns. In extreme situations, Henderson could call for corps artillery support, bringing the fires of heavy 8-inch howitzers and 155mm guns to bear on targets beyond the range of his battalion's 105mm pieces. This layered system of fire support meant that American infantry never fought beyond the range of artillery protection, a fundamental advantage that shaped every tactical engagement. Japanese communication systems operated under constraints that would have been unthinkable to American artillery officers. Radio equipment remained scarce throughout the war, with many artillery units relying entirely on field telephones connected by wire lines vulnerable to artillery fire and tactical movement. When American bombardments severed these wire communications, Japanese artillery batteries operated in isolation, unable to coordinate fires or respond to changing tactical situations. Forward observers, when they existed at all, communicated through runners carrying written messages that took minutes or hours to reach gun positions. By the time firing data was calculated and guns laid on target, American infantry had often moved beyond the impact area, rendering the belated Japanese fire ineffective. The contrast in fire control procedures was demonstrated during the battle for the town of Baguio in northern Luzon in April 1945. Henderson's battalion supported the 33rd Infantry Division's assault on this mountain stronghold, where General Yamashita had established his headquarters. The Americans planned their artillery support with meticulous attention to coordination and timing. Preparatory fires began at 0600 hours, with a rolling barrage that walked ahead of advancing infantry at a rate of 100 yards every 3 minutes. As infantry approached fortified positions, forward observers shifted fire to specific targets, bunkers, buildings suspected of containing command posts, and road junctions where Japanese reserves might counterattack. The precision of this fire support was remarkable. Henderson watched through binoculars as American shells impacted within 50 yards of advancing infantry, close enough that troops felt the concussion, but far enough to avoid casualties from friendly fire. When Japanese forces attempted to reinforce threatened sectors, Henderson called for interdiction fires that sealed road junctions within minutes. The entire system functioned with the practiced efficiency of an orchestra, each element performing its role in coordination with others, to create an effect far greater than the sum of individual batteries. Japanese artillery response to the American assault on Baguio revealed the limitations of their fire direction systems. Scattered batteries fired independently, with no apparent coordination or fire plan. Shells impacted across wide areas, rather than concentrating on specific targets. Some rounds fell short of American lines, others sailed far beyond. A few found their marks through chance rather than systematic fire direction. American counter-battery fire, directed by spotter aircraft and sound-ranging equipment, systematically eliminated Japanese guns that revealed themselves through firing. Within 2 days of sustained combat, Japanese artillery had been reduced to sporadic harassing fire, individual guns firing a few rounds before, displacing to avoid destruction. The material reality of ammunition expenditure during the Baguio operation demonstrated the insurmountable disparity between American and Japanese capabilities. Henderson's battalion fired 23,000 rounds during 6 days of fighting, an average of over 3,800 shells per day. Division artillery, which included Henderson's battalion plus 3 additional 105mm battalions and one 155mm battalion, expended over 100,000 rounds during the same period. Japanese forces defending Baguio fired perhaps 5,000 rounds total before ammunition exhaustion forced surviving batteries into silence. The 20-to-1 disparity in ammunition expenditure translated directly into casualties and territorial gains. American infantry advanced under an umbrella of fire support that suppressed Japanese resistance, allowed tactical maneuver, and provided psychological comfort to troops who knew overwhelming firepower was always available. Japanese defenders fought without comparable support, their own artillery too weak to provide effective counter-battery fire or to interdict American movements. The logistical achievement that sustained American firepower bordered on the miraculous when examined in detail. Lieutenant Robert Morrison, commanding the ammunition supply section for Henderson's battalion, oversaw operations that moved 200 tons of shells daily from beach dumps to forward gun positions. His truck convoys ran continuously, vehicles groaning under loads of 105mm projectiles that weighed 33 pounds each. Morrison calculated that his section had transported over 15,000 tons of ammunition during 5 months of operations on Luzon, an average of 100 tons per day during the entire campaign. This sustained logistical effort required not just trucks and drivers, but a supply system that extended back through intermediate dumps, beach operations, cargo handling at ports, shiploading in rear areas, and ultimately to factories in America producing the shells. The system functioned because American planners had anticipated requirements and built capacity to meet them. Ammunition production exceeded consumption even during the heaviest fighting, ensuring that supplies never ran short at forward positions. Japanese logistics had collapsed so completely by spring 1945 that even discussing ammunition supply became an exercise in documenting failure. Captain Shiro Nakamura, a Japanese artillery officer captured near Baguio, described supply conditions that would have paralyzed American operations within days. His battery had entered the Luzon campaign with a full basic load of ammunition, approximately 600 rounds per gun. By February, they were down to 300 rounds. By March, fewer than 100. In April, when American forces assaulted Baguio, Nakamura's battery had exactly 43 rounds of ammunition remaining. He received orders to conserve these precious shells for defensive fires of absolute necessity, firing only when American tanks appeared or when infantry assaults threatened to overrun positions. The psychological impact of this ammunition scarcity was devastating. Nakamura's crews understood they faced an enemy with unlimited firepower while they counted rounds individually. The knowledge that every shell fired was irreplaceable created a paralyzing caution that undermined artillery effectiveness even when ammunition remained available. The desperation of Japanese ammunition shortages drove commanders to measures that reflected both ingenuity and futility. Some batteries resorted to firing projectiles filled with concrete rather than high explosive, hoping the psychological effect of incoming rounds would slow American advances even without lethal effect. Others attempted to manufacture improvised ammunition, using captured materials, efforts that produced shells of such poor quality that they often failed to detonate or exploded prematurely in gun barrels. Most tellingly, Japanese artillery officers began preparing detailed plans for employing their guns as direct-fire weapons against American tanks. Recognizing that their artillery would be overrun before ammunition, exhaustion made the guns useless anyway. These measures represented not tactical innovation, but the systematic degradation of military capability under material privation that no amount of training or dedication could overcome. Henderson witnessed the human consequences of this ammunition disparity during the interrogation of captured Japanese artillery officers in late April 1945. Major Kenji Takahashi, commanding an artillery regiment that had defended the approaches to Baguio, spoke with the careful precision of a professional discussing technical matters rather than his own defeat. His regiment had begun the campaign with 72 guns and approximately 40,000 rounds of ammunition. By the time American forces reached Baguio, he had 18 guns operational and fewer than 2,000 rounds remaining. Takahashi described the tactical impossibility of defending against an enemy who fired 50 shells for every one his guns could answer with. Japanese infantry would call for artillery support against American attacks, but Takahashi could authorize only the most minimal fires, 3 or 4 rounds, when the tactical situation required hundreds. American artillery, by contrast, seemed to fire continuously, day and night, saturating Japanese positions with explosives that made movement impossible and reduced fortifications to rubble. The psychological dimension of this artillery disparity extended beyond simple fear of bombardment to a deeper recognition that the war was lost, regardless of individual courage or sacrifice. Takahashi spoke of the moment when he realized the regiment's resistance was militarily futile, not because his men lacked will to fight, but because the material disparity made victory impossible. He had watched American artillery preparations that fired more shells in 1 hour than his entire regiment could fire in a week. He had observed the mechanical efficiency of American logistics, trucks moving endlessly between supply dumps and gun positions, replacing ammunition as rapidly as it was expended. Most devastatingly, he had seen the calm confidence of American artillery crews, who fired without concern for ammunition conservation, knowing shells would always be available. This confidence, more than the shells themselves, revealed the unbridgeable gap between forces sustained by continental industrial capacity and those operating at the end of supply lines that no longer functioned. The climax of artillery operations on Luzon came not in a single dramatic engagement, but in the gradual recognition by both sides that Japanese resistance had become a holding action against inevitable defeat. By May 1945, American artillery had achieved such complete dominance that Japanese forces could no longer attempt coordinated defensive operations. Surviving guns fired only at night, 3 or 4 rounds maximum, before displacing to avoid counter-battery fire. Ammunition shortages had become so severe that some Japanese artillery units retained only 20 to 30 rounds per gun, reserves inadequate for even a single sustained fire mission. The mathematical reality was inescapable. American artillery was firing thousands of rounds daily while Japanese guns fell silent for lack of ammunition. The 10-to-1 disparity observed at Leyte had widened to ratios that made comparison almost meaningless. Henderson's battalion participated in the final artillery operations against Yamashita's Shobu group in the mountains of northern Luzon during June and July 1945. These operations demonstrated artillery's capacity to isolate enemy forces, interdict supply lines, and make organized resistance impossible, even when defenders occupied excellent defensive terrain. American guns fired continuously into the mountain valleys where Japanese forces attempted to establish supply dumps and command posts. Forward air controllers directed artillery fire onto any movement observed during daylight hours. At night, harassing fires denied the Japanese even the respite of darkness, random shells falling across suspected assembly areas and bivouac sites. The cumulative effect was the systematic destruction of military organization through sustained firepower that never allowed reconstruction or resupply. Japanese forces trapped in these mountains faced circumstances that transcended tactical defeat to become humanitarian catastrophe. Cut off from supply by American artillery fire, they starved while shells fell continuously on their positions. Medical supplies ran out, leaving thousands of wounded without treatment. Ammunition exhaustion forced artillery crews to abandon their guns, reducing artillery officers to infantry roles, for which they lacked training and equipment. Most devastating was the recognition that relief would never come, that the overwhelming American firepower would continue until organized resistance collapsed entirely. Staff Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, captured in early July, described conditions in the final weeks before surrender that revealed the complete collapse of Japanese military capability. His unit had received no supply deliveries for 6 weeks. Artillery had been silent for a month, the guns spiked and abandoned for lack of ammunition. Soldiers were reduced to eating grass and roots, their uniforms hanging on skeletal frames. When American infantry finally overran their positions, Tanaka and his comrades were too weak to offer meaningful resistance. The artillery fire that had isolated them had been more devastating than direct combat, destroying not through explosive force, but through systematic interdiction that made survival impossible. The final accounting of artillery ammunition expenditure during the Luzon campaign revealed numbers that staggered even professional military analysts. American forces fired over 3 million rounds of artillery ammunition during 6 months of operations, an average of over 16,000 rounds per day. Japanese forces fired perhaps 350,000 rounds during the same period, most during the first 2 months before ammunition shortages reduced Japanese artillery to irrelevance. The final ratio exceeded 10-1 across the entire campaign, approaching 20 or 30-1 during the last months of fighting. These statistics acquired human meaning through the accounts of survivors who had witnessed the systematic application of American firepower. Captain Henderson, writing in his after-action report, noted that his single battalion had fired more ammunition during the Philippine campaign than Japanese artillery in his entire operational sector. The mathematical disparity told a story of industrial warfare carried to its logical conclusion, where material superiority translated directly into battlefield dominance regardless of individual courage or tactical skill. The broader implications of this artillery disparity extended beyond the Philippines to shape American planning for the invasion of Japan. Military analysts studying the Luzon campaign recognized that overwhelming artillery support had been decisive in breaking Japanese resistance while minimizing American casualties. Planners for Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands, projected ammunition requirements that dwarfed even the massive expenditures in the Philippines. Initial estimates called for stockpiling over 10 million rounds of artillery ammunition, enough to sustain bombardments of Japanese defenses for months. The industrial capacity to produce and deliver such quantities existed, a testament to American manufacturing capability that Japanese planners could not hope to match. Had the invasion proceeded, the artillery disparity that had dominated fighting in the Philippines would have been magnified many times over, creating firepower concentrations unprecedented in military history. The technical sophistication of American artillery reached its apex in the specialized systems developed for specific tactical problems. Henderson's battalion received new ammunition types during the final months of fighting, including proximity-fused shells that detonated above ground rather than on impact. These variable-time fuses, developed through extensive research and testing, were devastating against infantry in open terrain. The shells burst overhead, spraying shrapnel downward across wide areas with effect far exceeding conventional contact-fused projectiles. Japanese forces had no equivalent technology, their shells relying entirely on impact or timed fuses that lacked the precision of American proximity systems. This technological gap added another dimension to American artillery superiority, providing weapons whose effectiveness exceeded Japanese capabilities, even beyond the overwhelming advantage in quantity. The industrial dimension of ammunition production revealed American capacity that Japanese planners had never imagined possible. A single American factory, the Kansas City Ordnance Plant, produced over 1 million artillery shells monthly by 1945. The United States operated dozens of such facilities, creating production capacity that exceeded the combined output of all Axis ammunition factories. This industrial dominance ensured that American artillery would never face the ammunition shortages that crippled Japanese operations. Even the massive expenditures during heavy fighting represented only a fraction of American production capacity, allowing stockpiling of reserves that guaranteed sustained operations for years if necessary. Japanese ammunition production, hampered by raw material shortages, inadequate industrial capacity, and Allied bombing, could not sustain even minimal rates of fire across dispersed Pacific garrisons. The final collapse of Japanese resistance in the Philippines occurred not through dramatic battlefield defeat, but through the quiet exhaustion of forces that could no longer sustain organized military operations. By August 1945, when Japan's surrender ended the war, American artillery had achieved such complete dominance that Japanese forces existed in isolated pockets, their artillery silent, their supply lines severed, their ability to conduct coordinated operations destroyed. The surrender revealed conditions that shocked even American officers accustomed to Japanese resilience. Artillery positions contained guns that had been spiked and abandoned weeks earlier when ammunition ran out. Supply dumps held empty, ammunition boxes, carefully stacked despite containing nothing. Most telling were the detailed records maintained by Japanese ammunition officers, documents showing the careful rationing of diminishing stocks, the desperate calculations of rounds per gun per day, the inevitable recognition that ammunition exhaustion would precede any possibility of relief or resupply. Henderson walked through abandoned Japanese artillery positions in the weeks following surrender, examining equipment and documents that told the story of systematic defeat through material exhaustion. One battery position contained a single gun with 12 rounds of ammunition remaining, carefully preserved against some final emergency that never came. Another position held detailed fire plans showing extraordinary tactical sophistication, plans that could never be executed because ammunition shortages made sustained firing impossible. Most poignant were the personal diaries of Japanese artillery officers, men who had been trained for years in their profession only to watch helplessly as American firepower rendered their expertise irrelevant. These officers wrote of the frustration of possessing knowledge and skill, but lacking the material means to employ them, of watching American shells fall continuously while their own guns stood silent, of the psychological collapse that accompanies recognition of utter material inferiority. The lessons of artillery dominance in the Philippines extended far beyond tactical considerations to shape American military doctrine for decades. The systematic application of overwhelming firepower had proven capable of breaking even the most determined resistance, provided ammunition supply remained adequate. American military planners internalized this lesson, building artillery-centric doctrine that emphasized massive fire support as the foundation of ground combat operations. The confidence that developed from Philippine operations would shape American approaches to warfare through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, creating a military culture that relied on firepower superiority to overcome enemy resistance while minimizing friendly casualties. This doctrine had its costs, measured in the destruction of cities like Manila, where American artillery contributed to civilian casualties in the tens of thousands. But from a purely military standpoint, the Philippine campaign demonstrated that industrial capacity transformed into sustained firepower could achieve decisive battlefield results, regardless of enemy tactical skill or defensive preparations. The human cost of this artillery-dominated warfare was measured not just in casualties, but in the psychological trauma experienced by soldiers on both sides. American artillery crews developed hearing loss, nervous conditions, and lasting psychological effects from months of continuous operations. The constant noise, the physical labor of ammunition handling, and the knowledge that their shells were killing enemy soldiers in wholesale numbers all took psychological tolls that would manifest in the years following the war. Japanese survivors carried different traumas: the helplessness of being subjected to bombardments they could not answer, the frustration of possessing weapons rendered useless by ammunition exhaustion, the gradual starvation resulting from supply lines cut by artillery interdiction. Both sides bore scars from a campaign where industrial capacity had been more decisive than individual courage or tactical brilliance. The statistical summary of American artillery dominance told a story as impressive as it was terrible. Over 3 million rounds fired, over 15,000 tons of high explosive delivered onto Japanese positions, hundreds of thousands of casualties inflicted directly or indirectly through artillery fire. The numbers validated what battlefield observation had revealed throughout the campaign: that American industrial capacity, transformed into sustained firepower through sophisticated fire direction systems and unlimited logistical support, had created military dominance that Japanese forces could not overcome regardless of defensive preparations or individual sacrifice. The 10-to-1 ammunition disparity was not merely a numerical advantage. It represented the decisive factor that determined the outcome of every engagement, shaped every tactical decision, and ultimately broke Japanese resistance through systematic application of firepower that never slackened and could never be matched. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.